Welcome to Books of Our Time. Books of Our Time is one of the Massachusetts School of Law's television programs, which are seen across the nation and collectively have won approximately 400 television awards. Today we shall discuss a book about a writer's search to learn what kind of person his father was, what motivated his father, what his father really believed. The book is My Father's Bonus March. It is by Adam Langer, who is with me today, and whose next book, called The Thieves of Manhattan, is being published in mid-July, just a few days after this taping. Adam Langer is, as said, with me today to discuss My Father's Bonus March. Also with us to discuss aspects of the book is a gentleman who knew Adam Langer's father since the age of 5 years old. He is Norm Budow, a retired professor of history and one of my own first cousins. When he was a youth, Norman lived in the apartment across the hall from Adam's father, as did, incidentally, my own parents, who lived for 11 years with Norman's family in a 3-room apartment. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law and the host of this program. I'd like to thank both of you for coming up to discuss the book. We have a lot of people coming up from New York, as we do from Washington and Boston. We have never had anybody from Santa Fe before. That is what they call a schlep. That's a long, long way. Adam, the book starts with you sitting on the steps of your parents' house in an area of Chicago called West Rogers Park.
Right.
A house on what in Chicago is called Mozart Street, but
Right.
for the rest of the country it's Mozart. But in Chicago, if we called it Mozart. And you're telling her stories about what happened on that street. Nora, your daughter, was 2 years old at the time, and I know you told me that she was aware at least that she was being told stories, even if she didn't wholly grasp all the substance of it. In any event, why were you sitting on the steps of the house where you grew up telling her stories about the block that you had lived on?
Well, I didn't really think about it that carefully at the time. It's something I do, and it's part of what made me become a writer was the stoop outside my parents' house in West Rogers Park on Mozart Street, as you put it. It was just a tradition for our family to sit outside in lawn furniture or on the steps and tell stories about the neighborhood. That guy over there, there's a whole kind of theater to the neighborhood, knowing the characters, knowing the interactions. And in some way, I was just repeating this tradition. And then I realized, as I was talking to my daughter, that there was something kind of deeper and more meaningful to it about passing on stories from generation to generation, showing her where I had come from. And that's how the book came about, was this idea of what had or hadn't been passed down to me and what I did or didn't want to pass on to my daughter. Just started with wanting to tell stories to keep because my daughter wasn't sleeping.
Yeah, well, that could make a lot of people storytellers.
Right, absolutely.
You say that the neighborhood was a form of theater. Do you think that was generally true in the neighborhood, or was it, rather than generally true, an aspect of your family, which was a very mentally adroit family and so forth?
But I think each neighborhood, if it is a true neighborhood and it's not, a suburban community where there's not much rhythm to the day, the neighborhood has its own rhythm. It has its morning, it has its night, it has its first act, it has its fifth act, it has recurring characters. You see them on the way out, you have to see them on the way in, you interact, conversations happen, that's the action. So it was a very vibrant Jewish community in Chicago. So the rabbi goes back and forth. It's like, the Jewish version of Thornton Wilder's Our Town. There's the milkman, there's the rabbi, there's the so forth and so on. So, I mean, it's not the most active play and dramatic one you've ever seen, but it does have a rhythm to it, and it does have a rhythm for storytelling as well.
It's really a terrible thing, in my judgment, that kind of neighborhood theater, for lack of a better word, seems to be passé around so much of the country today. I live in a neighborhood in New Hampshire so unlike the one I moved to in Washington in 1971, which was very much like you described. You never see a neighbor or neighbor's child on the street.
Well, I had learned something that I didn't know, actually. Another gentleman who you know and who wrote about our neighborhood, Joseph Epstein, who well-known short story writer and essayist. I told him about how this neighborhood wanted to make me become a writer, sitting on the stoop, seeing these stories. And he said, well, we never sat on the stoop because, we thought people we looked down upon people who sat on the stoop because there was something déclassé about it. But never seemed that way for me. And actually, this gentleman right here, one of my dad's, probably my dad's oldest friend, he was part of that theater too from time to time, because I remember Norman from when I was a child. He would bike by from time to time. He was the only friend of my father's from the old Jewish West Side who would just show up and become part of the scene, just bike over on the way back from teaching and then bike away.
Right. Interesting. Well, Norman, you and I lived, of course, I grew up 30 years earlier, but only 5 or 6 blocks from there. And Norman lived only another 7 or 8 blocks north in Evanston. You have a sense that comes through in the book, which I'd like you to elaborate on it, that so much is not known about our own forebears and their history. It's as if it were wiped out, both in terms of knowing about it in the mind, so to speak, and the physical things that represented where they lived and where their activities went on. And that is very similar in your judgment, which is what I'd like you to expatiate on, to the fact that so much of our history gets wiped off the face of the earth when it doesn't meet the approved script, because you looked all over. This book is written, your search for your father revolves around your attempt to find out what the bonus march of 1932 meant to him, and you went all over the country, and there's no physical remainders left, or they're vastly altered, and or there's very little in the relevant archives, like the Hoover archive or the FDR archive. So anyhow, a long-winded question, although the relationship, the similarity between forgetting the personalia of one's own background and the country forgetting its relevant history.
Well, my father was very fascinated with this incident of which you speak, the incident that forms the basis for the book, the Bonus March of 1932, which was an incident that happened in May, June, July of 1932, when about 20,000 veterans of World War I, who had been promised what they called a bonus, but was actually adjusted compensation to compensate them for their service, marched on Washington, or they descended upon Washington. They marched sometimes, but they had a tent city along the Anacostia River. There were about 20,000 of them. And they stayed there for the better part of a couple months, lobbying for this legislation. And when the legislation didn't pass, it was voted down, they stayed there and became something of a problem and an embarrassment for the Hoover administration, who wound up calling in the troops under General Douglas MacArthur. Eisenhower was involved, General Patton was involved. It was an ignominious incident in American history in which veterans of the World War I were essentially being smoked out by the current cavalry. Now, my father was fascinated by this incident for one reason or other. He said it was the most overlooked incident in American history. He kept on saying during various points of my life that someone should write a book about it. He wrote to the historian Barbara Tuchman saying that, do you think it's a good idea? And Barbara Tuchman wrote him back saying, yeah, you should write that book. Now, when my brother wanted to write a history paper, my father said, write about the Bonus March. When we would talk about what he did after he would retire from medicine, he was a radiologist, he said he was going to write this book. Now, he never did. And after he died, I was both interested in capturing his story, trying to capture the fleeting nature of it, but also the story he wanted to write. And I wanted to view his life through the lens of the Bonus March and see what had been forgotten that he thought should be remembered, at the same time seeing what I thought might be forgotten about his life and seeing what should be remembered about that.
And if I understand correctly, Adam, you thought that if you could solve the key of what attracted him to the idea of writing about the Bonus March, why he thought it was such an essential part, but overlooked part of history, you would also unlock a key to your father's personality.
Right, a key, though. Yeah. I mean, the idea of solving anyone's history through anything or defining a person through any sort of incident is kind of a foolhardy mission, and one can never truly solve it. I was inspired partially by my mother's favorite movie, Citizen Kane, in which you spend your life trying to find Rosebud, and then you find out it's a sled. Now that gives you some insight into the character of Charles Foster Kane, but doesn't really tell you that much overall. Ditto for the Bonus March with my father. It led me into a lot of paths and allowed me to find a way into talking to a lot of people who knew him and knew about the history, but I feel like I know him a little bit better, but still he's very much a puzzle.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he was a reticent man, as you describe him, which we'll get into in just a moment. But first, tell me, why do you think the Bonus March has been so largely forgotten?
Well, a number of reasons. One, it reflects very poorly on some individuals that we view as American heroes. The generals MacArthur, Patton, and Eisenhower I mentioned before. We have a way, particularly Jews have a way, of thinking that Franklin Roosevelt was this heroic figure. Well, he vetoed the bonus bill several times, and it passed over his veto, so he doesn't come off so well in that story. It's a story of American heroes fighting American heroes, veteran against army. And it is, if you want to tell the story about, you know, Roosevelt comes along and saves the day, leads us out of the Depression, and that's the story you want to tell, then the bonus army story isn't really a good story to tell because it contradicts that in some ways. Bonus army, so-called bonus army, was integrated. And that was long before the racial integration of the Army, and that's a story that hasn't been told to a certain extent.
And you know, there have been other things written out of American history. One of the things that fascinated me about what you were saying was that the problems of labor in the late 19th century, the problems of women, this stuff has all been slavery for up until the 1960s or 70s. The truth of what was going on in Reconstruction was written out of American history. So this is an old story that the Bonus March represents. And I was fascinated how when you were on the ground, you did a lot of research. And you went to Washington, D.C., where the march took place. You went to Johnstown, Pennsylvania, where on the retreat from Washington, so to speak, they camped there for a week or a month. And you were in the Hoover Library, you were in the FDR Library. There's either absolutely nothing on the ground and very little in the libraries.
Yeah, and very few people going there to research it either. And what I was trying to do was draw parallels between that and the stories that my father left out of his life. Because when we talked about our family story, my father's story was a story of young guy, very driven, Old West Side of Chicago, Depression era, studied, made it out, became a doctor, had 3 kids, and left that world behind. Well, there were a lot of parts of that story that I hadn't heard about either. Yeah. And life on the West Side, which I always thought is this kind of, you know, and it's my naivete to some extent. It was, you know, this image of, you know, stickball and sleeping in the parks and, you know, getting your 2-cent seltzer from the seltzer guy. Yeah. Well, there was a lot of pain in that story, and my father didn't lead as much of an idyllic life that he kind of worked himself out of. There was a lot of nuance there that didn't get told because it didn't fit the narrative, just as the Bonus March didn't fit the American history narrative.
Yeah. One of the reasons, Norm, you were telling me that one of the reasons people slept in the park was it was too hot to stay in the apartments.
And no air conditioning existed.
Yeah.
So it was self-supplying. Yeah. You went on the parkway with a blanket and a pillow, and you could get half a night's sleep, you know.
But what sounded, when my mother or father described it, that sounded delightful.
Well,
I mean, but probably not so much.
It was a personal survival story that I made through a hot summer night on the parkway.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Chicago always had that most wonderful combination: brutally cold winters and brutally hot summers.
There you go.
It still has that.
That hasn't changed. Part of you visited all your father's friends from the Old West Side. Now, let me say first, because a lot of our audience is Eastern and New England and up and down the East Coast. The Old West Side of Chicago, I guess the nearest comparison would be the Lower East Side of New York. I've asked friends here who grew up in Boston what would be comparable in Boston, and they can't really think of anything that would be comparable. So it's, as I say, the closest comparison is the Lower East Side. But aside from that, what did you find, and I'd like to hear from Norman too about this extent. What did you find out when you began talking to people? They all went to the same high school. They had a group in later days we would call it a kind of a sort of a pseudo fraternity, as it were. But they had a group who were very close in high school and kept close for the next 60 years. Amazing, amazing. What did you find about what was life like on the Old West Side of Chicago?
I guess what I got out of the stories of my father, who knew Norm for 75 years, and other friends who he knew for almost as much time, and the stories of going to high school together, meeting at the Jewish People's Institute on the West Side, was just the power and endurance of friendship, and how that in some way may be one of the stories that was able to allow my father to succeed in some way, that he had these relationships to draw on that lasted for this amount of time, that the people who he went to high school with, rode the bus with, were the same people who, when my father grew ill in later years, were the same people who came by, the same people who came to my birthday parties, the same people who were there at bar mitzvahs. And it was this connection and this, perhaps out of the, I don't know why those close relationships formed necessarily, maybe out of, maybe you could speak to that a little bit, but.
Well, you know, in reflecting back, it just seems to me that it's rare to have friendships last that existed in high school, and people have gone beyond high school, gone to war and all these other interruptions, and then come back and maintain connections. And the idea of connections, in fact, I'm just reflecting back on my own first reading about the West Side in a semi-objective way was the Old Bunch, Meyer Levin's, just like Fred Lonigan in the South Side, So.
Right. I'm going to have to get. I read Levin's book, I don't know, 40 years ago. I have to get it again. What was, Norman? What was the function exactly of the JPI, the Jewish People's Institute?
It was, I think, aspirations towards culture and education, both. So, just as a minor example, you'd have speakers, you'd have concerts. You'd have athletics. You'd have rooftop plays. I think was that. Whatever it was a fixture in our neighborhood, and it was a good thing to have.
Yeah.
And you got some rather esoteric speakers, as a matter of fact. For instance, I remember it was about 1936 or 37. I heard a lecture by a fellow by the name of Singh, S-I-N-G-H, and he was talking about British rule in his own country, India.
Yeah.
I think Singh is a Sikh, which kind of interesting religion. I know very little about the Sikh religion, except their own. They have their own thing.
Yeah.
And he was talking about what it's like to live when you have an empire ruling over you, And,
right.
It may be a rather decent empire, or it could be a brutal empire, but nevertheless, it's not you, it's somebody else over you. And he gave a little example, this is minor. There were British rules on how thick a walking stick could be, because a walking stick, if it's thick enough, it could be a cudgel instead of.
Yeah. So Norm, so the JPI was a place where with aspirations for culture.
Yes, you got it. Exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
And you went to Marshall High School.
Yeah.
And your father went to Marshall High School.
Right.
All the members of this group, which
Yeah.
call themselves the Bull Session, which is
Right.
kind of funny, 50 years later, 70 years later. Was Marshall High School, in later years, I learned that, of course, Marshall High School was a well-known basketball school.
Oh, man, was it?
And then when the Jewish people moved out to the north side,
Yeah.
and African Americans people moved into the same area, it became even more well known as a basketball high school for its basketball.
Right.
Just the other day, the New York Times had a story about Marshall High School and what they're trying to do now to get kids interested in and prepared for college. So.
Right.
Was it in your day a school? Was it heavily oriented towards study and academics and things of that nature?
Well, we did have a basketball team that had good plaudits. You know, we did have that.
Yeah.
And as far as a place for study and off-study and dwelling at study, it was a mixed bag. I think the very fact that most of them were Jewish, most of the kids were Jewish, implied that they had ambitions, you know, and aspirations.
Yeah, yeah. They had come to America, the families had come to America to better themselves economically.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah.
But if you dig a little deeper into Marshall history, a lot of noteworthy people came out of there in the entertainment industry and
absolutely.
politics. I mean, writers like Larry Gelbart, who was going to do an interview with me shortly before he passed away, and his writing partner Sheldon Keller, I believe. It might have been Shecky Green who went there, or someone like.
Yeah,
so,
no doubt.
And Shelley Berman.
Did he?
Yeah, who had a very arrogant attitude towards this book, and it was not the sort of book he would like to read, he told me. But a lot of noteworthy people did come out of that generation and that neighborhood.
And from that Old West Side milieu in general, I mean, the one that sticks in my mind extensively, of course, is because I'm a lawyer, is that Arthur Goldberg came out of there.
Oh, right, yeah.
And but in every walk of life, just like certain schools in New York City, like I don't know, James Madison or wherever, you know. Oh, and then there was an actress that was part. I mean, that's a. The story of your father and the actress Millicent Marks is a sort of a story of what might have been had she not been an ambitious actress and gone to New York, and that, of course, broke up whatever romance existed and so forth. But you did interview her.
Well, I tried to interview everyone from every step of the way of my father's life, from the people he knew in his childhood to, wasn't really a high school girlfriend, it was a high school girl / friend who was roommates at the Goodman School with the actress Geraldine Page, who studied at the Goodman.
Right.
And so I spent some time, it was a very poignant moment when I met her, because I've spoken to her on the phone, and this woman who my father always talked about throughout his life in terms of this wonderful actress and vibrant, strong woman. And I wondered, because my father always talked about her, what it would be like to meet her. So I went out to Beverly Hills, where she still teaches English as a second language, I believe. And I was wondering what she would tell me, whether I looked like my father, whether I didn't look like my father. And I was sitting here, and I realized for a moment, she couldn't really see what I looked like.
Yeah.
And the moment for whether I would resemble or not resemble my father had passed long ago.
Yeah.
So
this is an amazing thing to me. You always thought of your father as a gruff and cryptic guy. And yet you found that other people thought of him as a warm guy.
Right.
I'm interested in that, particularly Norman's wife, when she met you, and she made some remark, nonetheless, about you look like such a warm fellow.
Well, she said you remind me of your father because of the warmth.
Yeah, and you know, but she can't see me. Yeah, but she said something to the effect that it exudes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, how come you? Why do you think there was this dichotomy that other people saw your father as a warm guy and you did not?
Well, I mean, I think we're all made up of many layers and contradictions. I think my father very much enjoyed playing the role of the gruff individual. He enjoyed saying that, comparing himself to Lionel Barrymore. He liked putting on roles and playing a role, and I mean, he was a very loyal guy, a very loyal friend, a very close friend, which is, I'm sure, where the idea of his warmth and generosity comes from. At the same time, he wasn't, I mean, a lot of his relatives described him as someone who didn't suffer fools gladly. So, you know, he was a very generous person in some ways, but as a kid, he was a very forceful personality. He was a very strong guy. He knew what he wanted. If he was in a restaurant, he didn't want to wait more than a minute. Otherwise, he was out the door. He was there in the car, wanted you in the car at a certain time. He was always early for appointments. And, you know, he, as a kid, I mean, growing up, I can see that and find it amusing. But as a 5-year-old in that presence, that's a little intimidating.
How did you find him, Norm, in that regard?
Well, I was interested in Adam's statement that he was rather gruff sometimes. And I think if he had a family coat of arms, they would say, let's cut to the chase. Because
Right.
And you know, that struck me, Adam, as ironic because, well, we should say your father had a crippling hip problem from birth.
Right.
So he
What was it
couldn't
called?
move quickly.
what was it called?
Basically it's a dysplasia. Basically.
Dysplasia, okay.
Yes, sir.
So he couldn't move quickly physically, and in fact, when he was very young, he had to have crutches to walk.
Yes, he did. My
Which
earliest memories of it, still he was on crutches at that time.
Which he never told me about. Which that's never told me, even though he passed on the condition to me.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was something that was never discussed. That was part of the history that was written out.
Yeah, and there seemed to be reasons for that. But the contrast between the very quick movements, and he did everything very quickly, and the physical handicap was really quite stark in the book. You know, you couldn't hardly miss it, as they say. Your father, I gather that your father became increasingly withdrawn over the years.
Yeah.
Did you experience it that way? And I'm curious as to whether Norm experienced.
I did at the end, at the very end, very much so, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I was with him and Esther, and he was sitting in the corner, it seemed every now and then staring off into space, very silent. He was much less verbose than he normally.
Well, he was in a lot of pain, and he was sick.
Sure.
So
one of the things about him that was so interesting is that he was an artist. He had high artistic ability.
Yeah,
right.
that was surprising.
And you describe him as a storyteller.
right.
And one gets the impression that here was a man and he was regarded as very, very bright, you know, even as far back as high school. Anybody who knew him always regarded him as very bright. And one gets the impression that maybe here was a man who was somewhat frustrated because he had so many abilities. It's not always good to have too much in the way of talent. Of course, he channeled it very, very productively as a radiologist. And yet, here's all these other things he could do which went by the boards.
But I don't think, what I came to learn through the course of the book is that I kind of perceived this sort of frustration, or he could have written this book about the bonus march, he could have pursued his art. And I'm not sure if that was his frustration as much as it was my own. So I think one of the things I found through the course of the book is I was trying to find this idea that something was lacking in his life, and that's why we had not the closest relation. We had an okay relationship, it just wasn't close.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, you know, maybe he could have written this, and my mother always talked about what a great artist it was, how brilliant he was, how he could do this, how he could write this book about the bonus march if only he would want to. But one of, I think, partially why he was so difficult to know in some ways was because actually I think he was quite satisfied with his life. Yeah. He had a job that he liked, he had a family, he had a wife, he had a nice house in West Rogers Park. In some way, from the boy who'd grown up with this physical handicap in kind of tough times on the West Side to come here, I don't think he thought that was such a bad deal.
Yeah.
But because there was something lacking in my relationship, I think I took this bonus march as, well, if he were the kind of guy who would write this book, or he would, then we could have a closer relationship. Or if he had done something with art, then maybe there would be some more that he and I could have in common. But I'm not sure if he had a problem with it.
Yeah, right. Well, that gets into what you found at the very end when he wrote, I'll be content if things continue as they are.
Right.
It's obvious that perhaps your mother also, but I don't know about your mother, but certainly he passed on to you a lot of the side of him that did not get developed, the artistic side, the writing and the theater and so forth.
Right, of course. And I mean, my mother doesn't exist very much as a character in the book, largely because she's not the sort of individual who likes being in the spotlight. But it was interesting growing up because I grew up with this image, iconic image of my father who could do everything. My father who could have been an artist if he wanted to. My father who could have written this wondrous history if he wanted to. And my mother isn't a bad artist herself, and she's not a bad writer herself, and she was a pretty good singer herself, but kind of put whatever this idea of it was my father, but she has a story to tell herself as well. And in some way, that's kind of perhaps one of the reasons why I became a writer and an artist, is because my mother said these things of what my father could have been, but what he wasn't, and I kind of was always slightly sorrowful for what he wasn't, and maybe put my energies into that for that reason.
Well, and in those days, women existed to make their husband's life comfortable.
Yeah.
So that,
And he was very comfortable that way, yeah.
Yeah. We're going to take a very short commercial break. Stay with us. We'll be back shortly with Adam Langer and Norman Budow to discuss Adam's book, My Father's Bonus March.
Hi, my name is Ro Basine, and I'm the Assistant Director of Admissions here at the Massachusetts School of Law. We have a very hands-on approach to the application process here. Each and every applicant is required to come in and meet with a member of the admissions staff before their application can become complete. The accessibility of the administrative staff, as well as the professors here at MSL, is one of the reasons why I decided to come here. Another advantage that MSL has is the diversity of the student body. As a student, I felt very comfortable on campus because of the diversity of the student body. In the classrooms, the diversity brought lively lectures, fresh new perspectives to the topics that we were covering. MSL is also very committed to student success. Professors hold weekend help sessions, weekend study guide sessions that really deal with time management and how to write essay exams when you're in law school. If you decide to come to MSL, what you're going to get is an institution that is strictly committed to your success as a law student and as an attorney.
Welcome back. Your father, as from what you found out, as a radiologist, conducted himself in much the same way that I think you found him. He was perfectly a perfectly amenable, friendly person to his colleagues, but he was all business. It's just, you know, boom, 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 and he was the absolute fastest at what he did.
And that was the image he tried to portray of himself. He wasn't shy about saying how good he was at his job and how quickly he did it. Yeah. But I did it with him on Saturdays, and I thought that's the job I was going to do, was to be a radiologist. But yeah, he was always the first person to arrive. The x-rays would be on his desk. He would go through them, boom, 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 and he was the first person out. He had his own parking space that he liked right there. He arrived probably around 5:30 in the morning. He was done by 1, and you know, he chose a part of the medical profession where he could do that. Yeah. And it worked very well for him.
Yeah. Do you think Lenny, now there was a gentleman named Lenny Primer,
right,
who was a part of Norman's group and your father's group, and he told a story about why your father switched from being a general practitioner to being a radiologist. And my question is, A, do you believe the story? And B, if the story was true, how come Lenny Primer is the only guy he told it to?
Well, my dad told Lenny a story, and Lenny told me a story. Lenny, alas, passed away very recently, shortly, I mean, maybe a year after no, not even a year after I published this book. He was a big fan of the book, though, which was very exciting for me to learn. But he told a story that my dad was a general practitioner out in Park Forest, and some crazy husband of a patient accused my dad of taking liberties with his wife when he was examining her, and punched him out. And do I believe that story? I don't know. I mean, that's one of the problems with, you know, we're you know, talking at the School of Law. We're not dealing with absolute truths here. Right, we're trying to weigh the evidence, and we have one hearsay, not eyewitness report probably wouldn't hold up in a college of law. But my dad told lots of stories. Doesn't mean it's not true. Yeah. Though, I mean, I think the idea that kind of that my father preferred not to have to interact with patients there's truth to that, and that's why he chose radiology. And he chose a part of the profession where he could be alone doing what he did and being only responsible for that and not having all the interaction. I think that's true. Whether someone gave him a slug in the jaw because of taking liberties with sounds, most of what I found about my father's stories is there was a grain of truth in them. He very rarely told an outright invention, but he always did a little bit of embellishing, I discovered along the line. So I bet there's some truth to that story, but probably it sounds a little cartoonish to me.
Maybe somebody made a false accusation, but nobody slugged them. That kind of.
That's how all the stories seem. It's like my grandfather may not have served in World War I. He may not have been a veteran, but he probably did help out in some way. Everything seems to have a grain of truth in it.
Yeah. Well, let's go to I'm going to skip some stuff and let's go to some of those stories because they were a real revelation to you because. It's fair to say, is it not, Adam, that at first you had believed all your father's stories because why wouldn't you? You were a kid, and your dad tells you. And then you began to, as you talked to people who had never heard them or disputed them, you began to wonder whether there was anything to them at all. And then you finally decided, as you just said, there was a grain of truth, but he had embellished. So I'd like to go through some of them because some of them I find personally very interesting, starting with the change in your father's first name.
Right.
Yeah. Why don't you tell about that?
Well, the story goes that my father was born with the name Sidney. Yeah. And he was very, very sick with pneumonia and had some sort of operation. I don't know why you have an operation to deal with pneumonia. I don't know how that works, but supposedly that's what happened, and he did have a scar on his back to show me where the operation had been conducted. And he said that at his bedside, he was very, very sick, about to die. A rabbi said, if you change the name of a kid, it will fool the Dybbuk, the Jewish version of the devil. And that's why they changed his name to Seymour, and he became Seymour Sidney Langer. He told somebody else a story that said, he just didn't like the name, so he changed it. I like the idea of the Dybbuk story, but but I don't know for sure. But it's a good story.
And the core of truth was his name did change.
His name did change, and if you look at the birth certificate, it says Sidney and Seymour was added later. So it's
right. Actually, I did that because the name I was given at birth is Larry, and that seemed much too informal for a lawyer.
Right. So
there was another story which I think probably had a significant impact on your father, and that was the question of whether your grandfather Sam had served in World War I in the American Army.
Right.
Yep.
The story my father told was that my grandfather Sam Langer served in World War I. He was a mule skinner. Now, when there's a story I don't want to say that I completely accepted every story my father told me over the years because my father, had imparted a certain cynicism to me that he shared, so I had a little bit of that. So there was a little bit of doubt around some of the stories, but that was one I just took for granted. It seemed to make sense. The years matched up. My grandfather served in World War I and then opened up a pop factory on the Old West Side. But the more I looked into that story, I could find no verification for it. Nobody I talked to, cousins, uncles, my father's brother, friends, nobody ever heard of him serving in the military. I tried to find information from the National Archives, but all those records from that period, or a great deal of them, were burned, so there's no independent verification. There were I think there were a number of Langers in the military at that time. None of them were named Sam.
Yeah.
So for a while I thought it was to honor his father that he was interested in the bonus march, but now I don't know if that's just another story he told.
Yeah. Because in the First World War, they did use mules. And in about the first half of the Second World War, they did use mules. So it's possible.
Yeah. Oh, but my father was also a student of history, so would have known that fact as well. Yeah. And part of me also wondered while researching it is, I'm trying to find the truth of my father's stories, and my father was a reticent guy without a lot of telling a great deal about his life. Probably the same was true of his father as well, who came over from the old country at a time when probably parents were even less inclined to tell stories. So, maybe that was his way of making sense of what his father's life might have been.
I can tell you my father told me nothing, zero.
Zero.
You know a little bit about your father, but that's because he was politically active in Russia.
I had filling in the blanks from my mother about my father, see. So a lot of times people don't know about their fathers.
Yeah.
It's not unheard of.
Then there was a story, another military story, Adam, that you told about a cousin who allegedly was a general in the Polish army and surrendered, what was it, Warsaw to the Russians in 1920?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And the thing about that one was you never heard anything about that that indicated there was any truth to it until you played some reel-to-reel tapes taken in 1964, and you heard father speaking of his cousin Sidney, who had been the Polish general.
You know, the novelist in me wanted to put this together and say, that's Sidney, that's what my father was named after. This is the rosebud. This is the connection that this kind of like sews it all together very neatly. My family ran lots of reel-to-reel tapes at parties. I guess in the age before even home movies, they just ran tape, and so there were parties, and you know, my father interviewing members of the family, and I just listened to this one and played it over and over. I'm like, he's saying Sidney, and he's talking about this story that my father told about the general in the Polish army. And I didn't even know whose voice it was, and I had to go take the tape around to relatives until they identified, and they said, no, that's your grandfather.
Amazing. And then he used to talk about a couple of cousins and or uncles, Harry Bell and Sam Berkman, who were monetarily very, very successful people.
Right.
But he used to gild the lily even as to that.
I give 50% of the blame, should there be blame, to my father, and 50% of myself, who loves a good story and likes things as a kid. And as a kid, you know, liked fairy tales, liked things with, you know, this is a story, my cousin Sam Berkman, who, you know, made good, Old West Side, became head of bioscience laboratories, invented KO chocolate soda. And it turns out he worked for a guy who made KO chocolate soda when he was like 7 years old. But I mean, I assume when my father was telling a kid the story, bioscience laboratories doesn't mean much, but KO certainly does. And that was his way to make the story understandable to me.
And as it turned out, bioscience laboratories was quite a big deal.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, and got sold to Dow Chemical.
Right.
And then the story was that Sam Berkman had become head of Dow Chemical.
Which wasn't true. It was,
I mean, fat chance.
Yeah, exactly. And I had Sam Berkman, age 92 or so, on the phone to tell me what was true and what was not.
Maybe it comes out of his background, but I nonetheless thought it was quite shrewd, because you said that your father had described people as successful or something like that, and he said, you mean monetarily?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he had the attitude much like my father, cut to the chase, get to the point.
Right.
Yeah, what do you mean I'm successful? You mean I got a lot of money?
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
Yeah, so, but, you know, I give my relatives credit for all going on the record and talking to me and, you know, either debunking or supporting the myths that I came to find out about.
You had been told that your father lived in a house with about 10 or 12 kids at the University of Illinois.
Right.
And that one of the kids was Gene Shalit, who of course was on NBC, was it, in the morning show?
Still is.
Still is, there you go. And that they had lived in Shalit, you spoke to Shalit.
Yeah.
Tell what happened.
Gene Shalit told me the story about being at this, I think it was Allen Hall, or maybe it was an apartment in Champaign, Illinois. And Shalit told the story like, oh yeah, I remember your father, we were great friends, we lived in the house together, he's the only one I stayed in contact with. We all lived here. We used to bang on the floor of the woman below us. And then he said, oh, by the way, after the conversation, I have an old letter from your father telling me about some of our classmates. And he sent me the letter my father wrote to him in the early 80s. And it turned out my father said he never lived in that house.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you know, what can you trust?
Yeah, so Shalit tells you they had lived in the same house, and your father said, he must be senile. Because I never lived in that house.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Wow.
You know, but I mean, that was one of the challenges, and one of the interesting parts of the story was seeing how little you can rely on people's memories. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to put together, I didn't structure this as a traditional book where I go out to find this and this is what I learn. I wanted to talk to as many voices as possible, and figuring if you put them together, maybe you get, I don't know, 75% of what actually happened. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the book is, when you read it, it is self-evidently the work of a novelist as opposed to a didactic writer. You know, a didactic writer would state the question, state the evidence, give the conclusion. This is the work of a novelist, where the same thing keeps coming back again and again, and so in different guises and from different people. And so, you know, you finally, even dummies like me, finally pick it up that, you know, this is what the man is talking about, all told.
Right.
And the contrast in memory between Shalit and your father was just outstanding. I've never really quite seen it. That's beyond Rashomon. You know, Rashomon, you're looking at the same thing and you see it differently. Hey, either he did or he didn't live in that house.
Right.
Do you worry ever that you are keeping things out of the stories that you tell to your daughter?
Do I worry about it? I'm very conscious of it, is what I say. I think we all, we can't tell our whole stories, and so the book is about what are the stories we choose to tell, and why we choose to tell it. I am very conscious of trying to make sure the stories that I tell aren't simple with simple morals, aren't just, I did this and it was easy and I got from here to there. I try and have a certain amount of nuance to it. And, I thought for a while, growing up with the image of a father who is in some sense infallible and in some sense could do no wrong, could do whatever he put his mind to, was a lot to try and live up to. And the idea that my father was always first in everything, fastest in everything, it's an interesting story, and he was very talented, very brilliant, but that story is not true of anybody. But I always believed that myth as a kid, and trying to live up to it was difficult. So in the stories I tell, I try and leave room when I talk to my daughter for the fact that I might be wrong, for the fact that there might be contradictions. And, for better or for worse, I have a 5-year-old daughter who now questions everything and who doubts lots of things that I say. But, maybe, she'll have to seek psychotherapy at a very early age. I don't know. But I'm conscious of trying to make sure that I don't know everything and I'm not the best at everything.
I have known other people who have grown up in houses where the old man was nonpareil, tough, very, very tough way to grow up. But anyway, in the long run, and I think your mother disagrees if I understood correctly, your father came to terms with his life. He was happy with what he was doing, with what he had accomplished. And I guess that's why you feel that sadness about his, if that's the right word, about his not writing the story of the bonus march. That's your problem. That was not his problem.
Right. No, I think that's absolutely right. I think, my father died about 5 years ago, and he had a great, probably very, very good 75, 76 years. His last 4 years were not so great, and that's often what lingers in the mind. And I think people, when they try and assess that, are looking through, well, what could have been better? What if he had done his art, if he had his art to look at? What if he had his book to work in? And I think that's very understandable. And I gave a speech at my dad's funeral where I was thinking about how, all these things weren't accomplished. But the way my dad, I think, would have looked at it was, look, I had a great career. I had 3 kids who are still around. I've got a couple of grandkids. I had a very successful career that I was good at. You know what? That's not bad.
That's not bad at all.
And, in my father's estimation, that's not bad was one of the highest compliments he could offer.
So that being the case, and you do make an excellent case for that being the case, why do you think he kept saying that he would write about the bonus march, and why do you think apparently he said that to nobody? You talked to all these people, Norman and the rest of this group called the Bull Session, and relatives, none of them had ever heard about it. In fact, one of them said, yeah, your father told me he's going to write a book and blah, 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 blah. And you said, oh, he told you about the bonus march. He said, no, the Haymarket Riot.
Right. I think in some way maybe because my mother and I were always looking for the other aspect of him that could bring it out, this artistic side that was important to us. Maybe that wasn't so as important to his friends who knew him, and he didn't have to justify himself to his friends. They had known him for years. They knew who he had been and what he had become. Maybe he didn't, he was satisfied knowing that that's what they accepted him for who he was and what he did, whereas my mother, the artistic enthusiast, and me, the writer, I was like, what else? What else is there?
So that's why your mother disagreed, because it's sort of a case of you should have done more.
Well, we all can do more, really. And I think when we look at people who are, you know, my father did have a rough few years. We think about, well, what could make it better?
Yeah.
And what could have, and I think that's what we were looking at.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of, I could have been a contender. You should have done more.
Right.
You know, but hey, he was happy with what he was doing. And what do you think that the bonus march, I mean, did you come up with any conclusions as to what the bonus march meant to him?
Less than I thought it did, would be my conclusion. I think there are aspects of what I thought going in that were true, that he did feel perhaps slightly guilty that he was one of the only people of his group of friends not to fight in World War II, and he thought that these veterans should be honored. I think in some way, for me, it was almost a silent message to me of keep looking, keep searching for what's not being told. And that's what I got out of it, whether he intended to give me that message or not. What I got out of it was, here's something left out of the history books.
Yeah.
And find out, your job is to find out what's missing, to put together the pieces on your own. And that's what the book was about for me.
Do you feel that he thought that the bonus march represented the fact that the small man regularly gets the short end of the stick in this society?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's, you know, his mantra. Little guy gets screwed, and so be it. But he had a kind of a, you know, fatalistic attitude about that, kind of a throw up your hands, but you have to go working on your own, and that's what always going to happen. But the bonus march is a more nuanced story than that. Yeah. It's not about, I mean, it ended very poorly for a lot of people, but, you know, the bonus bill eventually did pass. It led to the passage of the GI Bill. And, you know, my message that I got, and when I talked to Senator John Kerry, what the message he got was like, keep persevering, keep on, keep moving on. And that's the message I got from it, also from my father's life, about moving fast, do your job, keep moving, keep working, keep persevering. And yes, little guy doesn't always make out so well, but, you know,
yeah,
we can't really throw up your hands about that.
We've had a couple of years of that in the last few years, so yeah. We are familiar with it. If we weren't before, we are now. Right. A lot of us were before. Norm, you benefited, as did, I would bet 4, 5, 6 million men of your generation from the GI Bill. Right. Which, as I understood it, one of the reasons for the GI Bill was because the Democratic administration, Roosevelt, did not want there to be a repeat of the bonus march and the other problems they'd had with the veterans. You know, maybe you could, you heard me say at lunch, I've told people for years, but I want you to explain it, that I think the GI Bill was the most important piece of American domestic legislation ever, with the exception of the Emancipation Proclamation. You know, why don't you yourself went to school on the GI Bill.
Exactly. They paid for it.
Yeah. Explain what it meant to your generation.
My government is giving me a chance to go to university. And I don't know what will be the consequence of it, but I'm going to benefit by it, you know. And it was in some ways rather bizarre because you had young people and veterans who are considerably older in classrooms.
But in any event, Norm, I mean, millions of guys went to a college on the It turned a large share of the working class into middle class white collar workers. I mean, that's what it came down to. And it sent people who became university professors, well, like you did, and people who became engineers, and people who had never had a shot in the society otherwise. So it was a fantastic thing. And it was one of the results of the bonus march. You mention in the book, I forget whether it was said to Cassius or by Cassius, you know, not in our stars, dear so-and-so, but in ourselves.
That we are underlings, that which my father wanted me to put in my bar mitzvah speech, yes. Yeah,
okay. What do you think the relationship of that was to his life?
Well, I mean, it's what I was talking about before in terms of, you know, you shape your own destiny and you keep pushing forward. I mean, it's interesting. I wanted to make 2 points regarding what you just said, which is in terms of the slippery nature of truth and how you can't trust perception. When my father, shortly before he died, he was working on what he called a memoir. It was about 5 or 6 pages, and it was about this doctor who inspired him, Dr. Eric Oldberg, a very prominent Chicago physician. And he wrote, one of the last things he wrote about Dr. Eric Goldberg, he's like, this didn't show up in the book. I asked one of my father's good friends, who also knew Dr. Eric Goldberg, he's like, worst teacher I ever had, aristocratic, didn't take any questions from students. Yeah, I hated that guy. And the other thing I wanted to say in relation to Norm and what he was saying is one of the reasons I wrote this book the way I did, not my own journey, here's what I did, here's what I came up with, is because I wanted not only my father's stories to be out there and preserved, I wanted the stories of his generation, and that's why Norm appears in a chapter, that's why his friend Lenny Primer appears in the chapter. I wanted to try and get all their stories so it wasn't just a story of one guy and his relationship with me, but the story of a generation, and trying to get all those voices in there as much as I could. There's a lot of stuff I had to leave on the cutting room floor for obvious reasons, but
Still bully for you that you did it that fashion.
Well, thank you.
For the last 15, 20 years, we've been hearing that we should have a lot of oral histories with the veterans of World War II, because there's not a lot of time left to get those histories, but invariably, they're talking about the military histories. And that's in a way a shame, because these folks all lived through what became one of the most formative periods of American history in general. And they created a lot of it, in medicine, in engineering, in business, and so on and so forth. And again, so much of it goes back to the GI Bill, which gave them all a chance to go to university, as the English say, a chance they would not otherwise have had. Okay, so what was the response of your relatives and your dad's friends to the book?
Well, my dad's best friend from high school, Lenny Primer, thought it should have won the Pulitzer Prize. He said that shortly before he passed away. Generally, the reaction has been very positive. The least positive reactions come from people who are very surprised that they're in a book. Even though they sat down with me with a tape recorder and me with a notepad going over archives, they find it odd that someone would be finding their stories worth telling. And they find it flattering in some ways, some of them, but also somewhat strange. And one of my interests is one person who I didn't get the chance to talk to, who sent me an email saying he was too sick to participate, was Studs Terkel, and who also wrote about the bonus march himself, or at least did oral histories related to it. And his concern a great deal was, the story of the little guy, the guy who's left out of the history books. And that's why, the book is dedicated both to my father and to Studs Terkel.
Do you think that the people who were surprised that their stories were worth telling, do you think that surprise stems from the fact that the little man is ignored so much in our histories and just in general?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think part of it is you sit down with your, grandnephew and he's talking to you. You don't expect to see it in a book. That's part of it. But also, by the same token, yeah, I think it's, the stories that should be told often are the ones that you wouldn't expect to be told.
Well, thank you very much. We have to wrap this up.
Well, thank you.
I thank you for coming up. I wish you all the best of luck with the book that's coming out and future books, of which I rather imagine there will be quite a few. And Norman, thank you for coming up. Okay, to the audience, thank you for being with us. I hope you enjoy this. I hope that, as I did from the book, you found it informational, and be with us again next time for the next installment of Books of Our Time. Thank you.